Imagine uncovering a family ledger that reads like a confession of unspeakable acts spanning 3 generations, documented with chilling precision. What if the darkest secrets of America's past weren't hidden, but proudly recorded as proper management? This is the true story of one woman's unimaginable endurance under slavery, a tale that forces us to confront the horrors our history books often gloss over. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the foundations of this nation. In the spring of 1849, a fire swept through the county records office in Clarendon County, South Carolina. Most documents were saved, pulled from the flames by clerks and volunteers who formed human chains, passing leather-bound ledgers hand to hand. But one set of records, already separated for review by a visiting state auditor, survived in a locked iron safe that protected them from both fire and water damage. When that safe was finally opened 3 days later, the auditor, a man named Jonathan Caldwell, sat alone in a temporary office and resumed his examination of what he'd been reading before the fire interrupted his work. The plantation books of the Beaumont family, records spanning 39 years. Documentation so precise, so methodical, so brutally honest about what occurred within the boundaries of the Beaumont estate that Caldwell would later describe the experience of reading them as confronting evil that had learned to keep perfect accounts. At the center of these records was a woman named Matilda, born into slavery in 1808. By 1849, she had given birth to 13 children across 3 decades, each child fathered by a different generation of the same white family. First by the plantation owner Theodore Beaumont, then by his son Nathaniel, and finally by Nathaniel's son Alexander. 3 generations of one family, one woman's body used as a bridge between them, and every birth, every transaction, every deliberate choice documented in handwriting that grew more confident with each successive generation. Caldwell had come to Clarendon County to audit tax assessments. He expected routine work, tobacco yields, property valuations, standard plantation economics. Instead, he found himself reading what amounted to a confession written by men who believed they had nothing to confess. The Beaumont ledgers didn't hide what happened. They recorded it with the same meticulous attention given to rainfall measurements and harvest dates, as if systematic sexual exploitation across 38 years was simply another aspect of agricultural management that required proper documentation. The pages Caldwell examined that spring revealed something historians would later struggle to name. Not just individual acts of violence, which were tragically common under slavery, but a multi-generational project. A deliberate pattern where each Beaumont male upon reaching adulthood was introduced to Matilda as part of his education in mastery, where fathering children with the same enslaved woman became a rite of passage, linking grandfather to father to grandson, a tradition as carefully preserved as the family's silver or their land deeds. What made these records different from countless other plantation documents was their explicitness. Most enslavers who exploited enslaved women maintained strategic silence in official records. Births would be noted without fathers. Mixed-race children would appear in inventories without explanation. The violence occurred in shadows that everyone acknowledged, but no one documented. The Beaumont family chose differently. They wrote it down. They dated it. They cross-referenced it. They treated the systematic abuse of one woman as information worth preserving for posterity. Caldwell sat in that temporary office reading by lamplight as Clarendon County rebuilt around him and realized he was holding evidence of something the law protected but morality condemned. Evidence that would force anyone who read it to confront a question. What does it mean that this was legal? That 3 generations of men could use one woman's body with absolute impunity, document every instance with pride, and face no consequence beyond the judgment of God they claimed to serve. Before we continue with what those records revealed about Matilda's life and the men who treated her as property across 4 decades, I need to ask something. If you believe stories like this need to be told, if you think we can't understand American history without confronting its darkest truths, then subscribe. Hit that notification bell. These are the stories that textbooks skip. So documented horrors that make people uncomfortable precisely because they're undeniable. And please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience stands when they hear these truths. The Beaumont plantation occupied 2,100 acres along the Edisto River, where South Carolina's low-country geography created ideal conditions for rice cultivation. By 1808, when our story begins, the Carolina Lowcountry had developed a particular form of slavery, distinct from other regions. Rice plantations required specialized knowledge, brutal labor in malarial swamps, and a task system that shaped how enslavers controlled their human property. The Beaumont family had established their holdings in the 1780s, building wealth through 3 generations of rice production sustained entirely by enslaved labor. Theodore Beaumont inherited the plantation in 1806 at age 24, following his father's death from yellow fever. He took control of an operation that enslaved 112 people, maintained extensive irrigation systems, and produced rice that commanded premium prices in Savannah markets. Theodore had been educated at what would later become the University of South Carolina. He traveled to England as a young man. He corresponded with agricultural reformers and read treatises on scientific farming. He brought to plantation management a particular combination of intellectual sophistication and moral blindness that characterized many educated enslavers. His wife Sophia came from another prominent low-country family. They married in 1807, and she brought with her a dowry that included enslaved people and additional land. The marriage was successful by the standards of their class. Sophia managed the plantation household with efficiency. She oversaw the domestic enslaved workers. She maintained social connections with neighboring plantation families. She bore Theodore for children between 1808 and 1816, Nathaniel, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Anne. Among the enslaved people Theodore inherited was a girl named Matilda, born on the Beaumont plantation in 1808. The records describe her mother as a field worker who died in childbirth. Her father was listed as unknown, though the notation bright next to Matilda's name in the slave inventory suggested mixed ancestry even from birth. Matilda was raised in the plantation quarters by women who cared for enslaved children while their mothers worked the rice fields. She survived childhood diseases that claimed many enslaved infants. By age 8, she'd been moved to work in the main house, a transition that removed her from the deadliest plantation labor but placed her under the direct supervision of the Beaumont family. The household dynamics of a low-country plantation created a particular proximity between enslaved, domestic workers and the white family. Matilda would have served meals, cleaned rooms, carried water, tended fires, moved through the private spaces of the main house daily. She would have been visible to Theodore constantly, present in ways that field workers were not, young and vulnerable. In an environment where Theodore held absolute legal authority over her body and her future. The first entry appears in Theodore Beaumont's personal journal in August 1824. Unlike the plantation's main ledgers, which tracked rice production and enslaved people's births and deaths in columns and numbers, Theodore kept a separate journal where he recorded observations about plantation management, experiments with rice varieties, and thoughts on the challenges of maintaining discipline and productivity. This journal, discovered by Caldwell in 1849, contained passages that Theodore never intended for outside review, but preserved nonetheless. Matilda has matured into a useful house servant. Theodore wrote in August 1824, "She shows intelligence in learning tasks and maintains proper deference. At 16, she represents increasing value as property, though her utility extends beyond typical domestic service. I have determined that certain arrangements, while not openly discussed, serve multiple purposes in plantation management." The girl understands her position. She has been instructed clearly. These matters require discretion, but not apology among men who understand the realities of our situation. The language was coded, but clear. Theodore was documenting his decision to begin sexually exploiting Matilda. The entry's tone combined self-justification with assumption of entitlement. He framed his actions as arrangements and utility, transforming rape into management decision. The phrase, "she understands her position," carried particular cruelty. Matilda had no choice. Understanding meant only that she'd been informed of what would happen, and new resistance was futile. Matilda was 16 years old. Theodore was 42. Married, father of 4 children, respected member of the planter class, elder in the Presbyterian Church. The legal system of South Carolina granted him absolute authority over Matilda. She could not refuse him. She could not report him. She could not escape. If she became pregnant, the child would be his property. Adding to his wealth while testifying to his crime in features that everyone would see but no one would officially acknowledge. The plantation's main ledger recorded the first consequence in May 1825. Matilda delivered of a daughter. Healthy, light complexion, named Sarah. No father listed. The omission was standard practice, but in this case, deliberate. Theodore chose not to acknowledge paternity in the business records, even while documenting his actions in his private journal. The separation suggested awareness that what he was doing required some concealment, even in a society that broadly tolerated such exploitation. Over the next 7 years, 3 more children appeared in the ledgers, all born to Matilda, all listed without fathers, all described with terms like bright or light that indicated mixed ancestry obvious to anyone who saw them. Theodore's journal contained occasional references to these births, noted with the same tone he used for successful rice harvests or the purchase of new farm equipment. Matilda has proven reliably productive. He wrote in 1827, "The children represent appreciating assets while serving immediate household needs as they mature." The dehumanization was complete. Matilda existed in Theodore's accounting as a production unit. Her children were assets. Their suffering was irrelevant to calculations of utility and value. And Theodore recorded these observations in permanent ink. Confident they would never bring consequence because the law and society both protected his right to do exactly what he was doing. Nathaniel Beaumont, Theodore's eldest son, was 17 years old in 1825 when Matilda gave birth to her first child. He was growing up in a household where his father's exploitation of an enslaved woman occurred openly enough that everyone knew, but quietly enough that no one spoke of it directly. This was the world that shaped Nathaniel's understanding of power, of manhood, of what it meant to own other human beings. Theodore invested considerable attention in Nathaniel's education. The boy was sent to Savannah for formal schooling between ages 12 and 16, studying classics, mathematics, and the agricultural sciences that wealthy planters valued. But his real education occurred at home, watching his father manage the plantation, learning through daily observation how authority functioned in a world built on slavery's absolute hierarchy. He learned that enslaved people existed for white convenience, that their bodies could be used in whatever ways served the master's interests, that this was not just permissible, but natural, ordained by God, and protected by law. Theodore's journal from 1831 contains an entry that reveals how deliberately he approached passing these lessons to his son. Nathaniel returns from Savannah next month, nearly 23, and ready to assume greater responsibilities in plantation operations. I have determined to educate him fully in all aspects of management, including those arrangements that maintain proper order and satisfy natural requirements. The boy has romantic notions from too much reading, but practical experience will correct these. He must understand that effective mastery requires exercising all forms of authority, not merely those discussed in polite company. The language was careful, almost bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Theodore intended to introduce Nathaniel to the systematic sexual exploitation he'd been practicing with Matilda for 7 years. This wasn't casual mention or indirect suggestion. Theodore planned to teach his son that using enslaved women sexually was part of plantation management, a practice to be learned and continued across generations. The main plantation ledger recorded what followed in February 1832. Matilda delivered of a son healthy fair complexion named Daniel, Father Nathaniel Beaumont. Unlike the previous births, this entry included paternity. Theodore made the choice to document his son's actions explicitly, creating an official record that linked Nathaniel to Matilda and her child. The notation suggested pride rather than shame, acknowledgement rather than concealment. Theodore was documenting a tradition successfully transferred from one generation to the next. Matilda was 24 years old. She had already borne 4 children to Theodore. Now his son, barely older than some of her earlier children, had been directed to her as part of his education and mastery. The journal entries from this period contain no record of Matilda's experience, no acknowledgement of her humanity, no consideration of what it meant for a woman to be systematically passed between father and son like inherited property. The records preserved facts while erasing every element of human suffering that those facts represented. Nathaniel's own journals, which he began keeping in 1832. Following his father's example, show a young man struggling initially with something that troubled his conscience before gradually accepting it as normal. An early entry from March 1832 reads, "Father instructs me in matters I find difficult to reconcile with Christian teaching. Yet he demonstrates through Scripture that proper order requires firm authority in all things. The Negro woman Matilda serves purposes beyond household work, and I am told this arrangement is common among well-managed plantations, though not discussed openly. I must learn to see property as property, not as persons who might claim rights they do not possess." The entry reveals Nathaniel's internal negotiation, his attempt to rationalize what he knew was wrong by accepting his father's framework. Within a year, his journal entries had shifted tone entirely. By 1833, he wrote about Matilda with the same casual ownership his father displayed, the same reduction of human being to utility. The moral struggle had been resolved by embracing the logic of slavery so completely that exploitation became management and rape became prerogative. Sophia Beaumont, Theodore's wife and Nathaniel's mother, lived through all of this in the main house where Matilda worked and bore children that increasingly resembled the Beaumont men. The historical record offers only fragments of Sophia's perspective, occasional letters to relatives that referenced plantation life in carefully coded language. In one letter from 1833, discovered in family papers decades later, Sophia wrote to her sister in Savannah, "Domestic arrangements here follow patterns common to our region, though I confess they trouble my Christian conscience. Yet what authority do I possess to object? The law grants my husband absolute discretion in managing his property, and my role is to maintain household order, not to question his decisions in matters beyond my influence." The letter captured the complicity built into plantation society, particularly for white women who benefited from slavery's wealth while lacking power to challenge its practices. Sophia saw what was happening. She understood that Matilda's children bore Beaumont features, that Theodore and now Nathaniel were exploiting an enslaved woman under her own roof. But she framed her silence as powerlessness, her inaction as proper feminine deference to male authority. This was how the system sustained itself through layers of participation and complicity that extended beyond the direct perpetrators. The 1828s and 1838s brought significant changes to the Beaumont plantation's operations and structure. Rice prices fluctuated with international market pressures. Theodore experimented with new irrigation techniques and expanded the plantation's acreage through purchases of adjacent properties. The enslaved population grew through both natural increase and strategic purchases at Savannah auctions. By 1838, the Beaumont plantation enslaved over 190 people, making it one of the larger operations in Clarendon County. Matilda's children were growing up during these years, occupying an ambiguous space in the plantation hierarchy. They were clearly mixed race, obviously related to the Beaumont family, yet still enslaved and subject to the same absolute authority as any other enslaved person. Sarah, the eldest, worked in the main house alongside her mother. Daniel, Nathaniel's acknowledged son, showed intelligence that Theodore noted in ledgers as increasing his future value. The younger children learned various tasks, their assignments determined by assessments of their capabilities and the plantation's needs. Nathaniel married in 1836, a woman named Victoria Porter from a prominent Charleston family. She moved to the Beaumont plantation, and the presence of Nathaniel's wife complicated household dynamics in ways the records hint at, but never fully explain. Victoria certainly encountered Matilda and her children. She certainly noticed Daniel, who by age 4 bore unmistakable resemblance to her husband. A letter from Victoria to her mother in Charleston, dated 1837, mentioned finding plantation life more complex than anticipated, with arrangements that require adjustment to sensibilities formed in city environments. Despite his marriage, Nathaniel continued the pattern with Matilda that his father had established. The ledgers show 3 more births between 1837 and 1841, all documented as Nathaniel's children with Matilda. Theodore's journal entries from this period expressed satisfaction with his son's management abilities, and noted approvingly that Nathaniel had learned to handle all aspects of plantation operations without squeamishness or excessive sentiment. Theodore Beaumont's health began declining in 1842. At 60, he suffered from respiratory problems and recurring fevers common to low-country residents who'd spent decades in malarial regions. As his condition worsened, he spent increasing time organizing his papers and preparing for the transition of authority to Nathaniel. His will, drafted with assistance from a Charleston attorney in early 1843, disposed of his property according to careful calculations. The plantation and most enslaved people would go to Nathaniel as primary heir, with provisions for Theodore's daughters and younger son. Specific clauses addressed Matilda and her children. They were to remain together, assigned to Nathaniel, with notation that these individuals represent significant accumulated property value that would be diminished by separation, and their continued presence serves established plantation functions. The language was deliberately vague, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the situation. Theodore was ensuring that the arrangement he'd created and passed to his son would continue after his death. Theodore died in August 1843. Leaving Nathaniel as master of the Beaumont plantation at age 35. The transition was smooth. Nathaniel had effectively managed operations for years under his father's guidance. He continued the meticulous record-keeping Theodore had established, maintained the rice cultivation techniques that produced consistent yields, and preserved the systematic documentation that treated enslaved people as inventory, requiring precise accounting. And he continued the pattern with Matilda, now 35 herself. She had already borne 10 children across 19 years. Her body showed the cumulative damage of continuous pregnancy, childbirth, and unrelenting domestic labor. A traveling doctor who visited the Beaumont plantation in 1844 to treat Sophia's illness noted in passing that one of the house servants appears worn beyond her years, moving with difficulty, though she continues her duties with admirable persistence. The observation was clinical, detached, absent any recognition that Matilda's condition resulted directly from decades of systematic exploitation. This blindness characterized how white Southerners trained themselves to see enslaved people. They could notice suffering without acknowledging its causes, observe consequences without questioning the system that produced them, document facts while remaining willfully ignorant of meanings those facts revealed. Nathaniel's son, Alexander, was born in 1839, the first child of Nathaniel's marriage to Victoria. As young Alexander grew from infant to child, he was cared for partly by enslaved women in the household, including Matilda's daughters. The irony was stark, but unremarked. The white child, heir to the plantation, was being tended by his father's children through an enslaved woman. His own half-siblings, who would never be acknowledged as such, who existed in his world as property rather than family. By 1846, Matilda had borne 12 children. 6 to Theodore between 1825 and 1831. 6 to Nathaniel between 1832 and 1846. 2 generations of Beaumont men had used her systematically across 22 years, documenting each birth with the same careful attention they gave to rice harvests and equipment purchases. The children ranged from 21-year-old Sarah down to an infant born that spring. Several had themselves begun having children, adding to the plantation's enslaved population, creating a network of families whose origins testified to decades of sexual violence that everyone saw, but no one officially acknowledged. The late 1838s brought tensions to South Carolina that would eventually culminate in secession and war, though no one yet understood where events were leading. Debates over slavery's expansion into Western territories intensified. Northern abolition movements gained strength despite fierce Southern resistance. Some enslavers worried about the institution's future, while others insisted that slavery would endure permanently. Protected by constitutional guarantees and economic necessity. Nathaniel's journals from this period show a man increasingly defensive about his way of life, increasingly insistent that slavery benefited both masters and enslaved people, increasingly convinced that outside criticism came from ignorant meddlers who understood nothing of Southern society. He wrote extensively about slaves being naturally suited to bondage, about the Bible sanctioning slavery, about the plantation system creating civilized order out of African barbarism. The entries revealed someone constructing elaborate justifications for a system he benefited from and refused to question. Nowhere in these self-justifying passages did Nathaniel acknowledge Matilda as human. Nowhere did he consider whether his children with her experienced pain or confusion about their status. Nowhere did he reflect on the moral implications of a pattern where his own son was growing up in a household shaped by the same exploitation Nathaniel had learned from his father. The blindness was complete, sustained by ideological frameworks that made slavery's defenders immune to recognizing their own cruelty. Alexander Beaumont was 7 years old in 1846, an age when children begin understanding their world structure and their place within it. He was being raised to inherit the plantation, educated in the responsibilities of mastery, taught to see enslaved people as property whose management required firmness and strategic thinking. Nathaniel involved his son in plantation tours, explaining rice cultivation, demonstrating authority, modeling the behaviors that would prepare Alexander to eventually take control of operations. And Alexander was learning through daily observation the unspoken rules governing relationships between white men and enslaved women. He saw Matilda and her children. He heard conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He absorbed assumptions about power and race and gender that would shape his understanding of what masters were entitled to expect from those they enslaved. The pattern was preparing to repeat into a third generation. The 1848s arrived with South Carolina more deeply committed to slavery than ever before. Despite growing national tensions over the institution's future, the Compromise of 1848 had temporarily eased sectional conflicts, but debates continued to intensify. In Clarendon County, where enslaved people outnumbered white residents by overwhelming margins, the planter class maintained its authority through laws that grew increasingly harsh and a culture that demanded absolute loyalty to the slavery system from every white person, regardless of their actual power or wealth. Nathaniel Beaumont had become one of the county's prominent planters by this time. At 40, he managed a thriving operation that produced rice commanding premium prices in domestic and international markets. He held positions of respect in local government and the Presbyterian Church. He corresponded with other planters about agricultural innovations and political strategy. To outside observers, he represented the success and stability of the plantation system, a man who had inherited wisely and managed effectively. The fire that swept through Clarendon County's records office in March 1849 might have destroyed all evidence of what occurred on the Beaumont plantation had those particular ledgers not been locked in an iron safe for audit review. Jonathan Caldwell, the state auditor who'd been examining them, returned to his work after the fire with a sense that something beyond ordinary providence had preserved these specific documents. His initial review had already troubled him. Now, continuing through the later volumes, he discovered that the story he thought he understood was still unfolding. Caldwell found entries showing that Matilda had borne 2 more children since 1846, bringing her total to 14 across 24 years. Her health had deteriorated significantly, noted in Nathaniel's journals. With the detached concern one might show for aging equipment, Matilda increasingly limited in her capacities. Nathaniel wrote in 1848, "The years of service have accumulated effects, though she remains useful in lighter duties." Her daughters now assume primary household responsibilities, continuing the family's reliable service. The phrase "continuing the family's reliable service" carried layers of meaning that Caldwell found deeply disturbing. Nathaniel was noting that Matilda's daughters, now young women, were taking over the domestic work their mother could no longer perform as efficiently. But the phrasing also suggested something more ominous, a continuation of the service that had defined Matilda's entire adult life. Caldwell turned to the ledgers, tracking births among the enslaved population. What he found there made him set down his pen and close his eyes for a long moment. Sarah, Matilda's eldest daughter, born in 1825 to Theodore Beaumont, had given birth herself in 1848. The entry was clinical. Sarah delivered of a daughter, healthy, light complexion, named Grace. Father, Nathaniel Beaumont. Nathaniel had fathered a child with his own daughter. The girl born to him and Matilda 23 years earlier had been used by him exactly as her mother had been used by Theodore and then by Nathaniel himself. The pattern wasn't just continuing across generations of Beaumont men. It was expanding to include the daughters born from previous exploitation, creating a web of abuse that grew more complex and horrifying with each new entry Caldwell examined. But even this wasn't the full scope. As Caldwell continued reading through Nathaniel's journals and the plantation ledgers, he discovered entries documenting something he initially struggled to believe. Alexander Beaumont, Nathaniel's legitimate son, had turned 18 in 1857, and in the spring of that year, just months before Caldwell arrived to audit the records, the ledger contained a new entry. Matilda delivered of a daughter, healthy. Fair complexion, named Ruth. Father Alexander Beaumont, 3 generations. Theodore had used Matilda starting in 1824. Nathaniel had used her starting in 1832, and now Alexander. The grandson had continued the pattern in 1857. Matilda had borne children to grandfather, father, and grandson across 33 years. She was 49 years old when she gave birth to Ruth, her 15th child. Fathered by a young man she had known since his infancy, the son of Nathaniel, the grandson of Theodore, continuing a tradition of exploitation that had consumed her entire adult life. Caldwell sat alone in that temporary office, surrounded by ledgers that documented what should have been unthinkable, but was instead carefully recorded, cross-referenced, preserved as plantation business. He read Nathaniel's journal entry from March 1857, written shortly before Alexander's 18th birthday. "I have determined to educate Alexander in the full scope of his responsibilities and privileges as master of enslaved property. My father performed this service for me, and I now undertake it for my son. The boy must understand that authority includes dimensions not discussed in church or at table, but essential nonetheless to maintaining proper order. Matilda, though aged, serves this educational purpose, as she has served the family throughout her years here." The entry's tone was matter-of-fact, almost pedagogical. Nathaniel was describing his decision to direct his 18-year-old son to rape a 49-year-old enslaved woman as casually as he might describe teaching Alexander to evaluate rice quality or manage field labor. The systematic nature was undeniable. This wasn't exploitation occurring haphazardly or opportunistically. It was deliberate tradition consciously passed from generation to generation, with Matilda's body serving as the vehicle for teaching young Beaumont men what it meant to possess absolute power over other human beings. Alexander's own journal, which he'd begun keeping upon his 18th birthday, following family tradition, contained entries that showed the same trajectory his father had experienced decades earlier. Initial discomfort gradually overcome by acceptance of the framework that made exploitation seem natural. Father instructs me in matters I find difficult at first to comprehend as part of Christian mastery, K. Alexander wrote in April 1857. Yet he explains that sentiment must not prevent necessary exercises of authority. The Negro woman Matilda has served 3 generations of our family, and this continuity demonstrates proper management of human property. I am learning to think correctly about these things, setting aside notions that would weaken the resolve required of men in our position. Within months, Alexander's tone had shifted completely. By the end of 1857, he wrote about plantation management, including the arrangements with enslaved women, using the same casual language of ownership his father and grandfather had employed. The moral education was complete. Alexander had been taught to see Matilda and other enslaved people as objects for use, their humanity erased by legal frameworks and social customs that defined them as property. Caldwell discovered more as he read deeper into the recent records. Alexander had not limited his attention to Matilda. Several of her daughters, including Sarah and others born to Theodore and Nathaniel, appeared in entries, suggesting Alexander was continuing the pattern with them as well. The exploitation was expanding systematically, the 3rd generation building on foundations the first 2 had established, creating layers of abuse that became increasingly difficult to track as the family trees grew more complex through births that resulted from rape across decades. The spring of 1848 had brought another development that revealed how thoroughly the Beaumont family had normalized this systematic exploitation. Nathaniel's younger brother, Thomas, who had inherited a smaller neighboring property from Theodore's estate, visited the main plantation regularly. Thomas's journal, which Caldwell found filed with family papers, contained an entry from May 1848, expressing envy of Nathaniel's advantageous arrangements with reliable house servants, and noting his intention to establish similar efficiency on my own property by studying Nathaniel's methods. The language was coded but clear. Thomas admired the systematic sexual exploitation his brother practiced and wanted to replicate it. The Beaumont pattern wasn't contained within one household. It was being recognized by extended family as a model worth copying. Management technique that could be discussed in abstracted language that avoided naming what was actually being described. Victoria Beaumont, Nathaniel's wife, remained present through all of this, maintaining the household, raising her children, managing the social obligations of a prominent planter's wife. Her letters from the 1848s, few of which survived, showed a woman who had long since made peace with arrangements she'd initially found troubling. A letter to her sister in 1849 mentioned that plantation life requires accepting practices common to our region. And I have learned that domestic harmony depends on not examining too closely those matters that fall within my husband's authority to manage as he sees fit. The acceptance was complete. Victoria had resolved whatever moral discomfort she initially felt by embracing the same willful blindness that characterized the entire planter class. She lived in a house where her husband had children with an enslaved woman, where her son had been taught to do the same, where the evidence of systematic sexual violence surrounded her daily in the faces of Matilda's children and grandchildren, and she had trained herself to see none of it, to maintain the fiction that these were simply standard plantation arrangements requiring no acknowledgement or examination. Matilda herself remained absent from the records as a human being with thoughts, feelings, or experiences worth documenting. Everything written about her reduced her to property, production, utility. Whether she experienced these decades as continuous trauma or had found some way to psychologically survive by disconnecting from her own suffering. Whether she loved her children or resented them as products of violation. Whether she maintained hope for eventual escape or freedom, or simply endured one day after another until death might release her. None of this appeared in any document Caldwell examined. The records preserved only facts, births, dates, fathers acknowledged with pride rather than shame. They documented systematic exploitation across 3 generations while erasing every trace of the humanity being exploited. Matilda existed in the Beaumont ledgers as an entry in inventories, a name attached to births, a piece of property whose decades of service were noted with the same tone used for describing productive livestock or durable equipment. By 1849, when Caldwell conducted his audit, Matilda had survived 25 years of being used by Theodore, 17 additional years of being used by Nathaniel, and was now being used by Alexander. She was 51 years old. She had borne 15 children to 3 generations of Beaumont men. She had grandchildren who were also her children, creating genealogical tangles that the ledgers tracked for property purposes while ignoring their human implications. She had spent her entire adult life as the vehicle through which Beaumont men learned mastery, her body treated as educational tool and productive asset, her suffering irrelevant to calculations that measured only utility and value. The plantation records showed that several of Matilda's children had been sold in the late 1840s when Nathaniel needed cash for expansion projects. They appeared in ledgers as transactions sold to Colonel Patone of Edisto Island. The Negro boy David, age 14, for $850. David was one of Nathaniel's sons with Matilda. The sale separated him from his mother and siblings permanently, sending him to labor on another plantation, where his origins and family connections meant nothing. The transaction was recorded in the same columns that tracked sales of rice and purchases of equipment. One more economic calculation in the endless accounting that slavery required. Other children remained on the Beaumont plantation, growing into roles determined by the plantation's needs and the Beaumont family's assessments of their capabilities. Some worked in fields, some maintained irrigation systems, some, particularly the daughters, served in the main house alongside Matilda when she was still capable of such work. All of them lived with the knowledge of their origins, understanding that they existed in ambiguous space between family and property, sharing blood with their masters while remaining subject to the absolute authority that allowed those masters to use them in any way they chose. Caldwell found himself reading faster now, driven by a need to reach the end to see if there was any recognition of wrongdoing. Any moment where someone in the Beaumont family acknowledged the humanity they'd been systematically violating for decades. But there was nothing. The journals ended with Alexander's entries from early 1849 documenting plantation operations, rice prices, weather conditions, and the continued useful service of Matilda and her daughters. Routine observations about routine matters requiring routine management. The horror was precisely in that routine quality. The Beaumont family had committed systematic sexual violence across 3 generations and documented it with the same casual precision they applied to tracking tobacco yields and equipment maintenance. They had treated rape as management technique, exploitation as tradition, and continuous abuse of one woman and her daughters as simply one more aspect of the plantation economy requiring proper record-keeping. And it was all legal. Every act Caldwell read about in those ledgers was protected by South Carolina law. Enslaved people could not refuse their masters. They could not testify against white people in court. They had no right to bodily autonomy. They were property, and property owners could use their property as they wished. The Beaumont family had done nothing illegal. They had simply documented with unusual thoroughness what countless other enslavers practiced without creating such detailed records. Caldwell closed the final ledger and sat in silence as afternoon faded toward evening outside. He was a state auditor tasked with assessing property values for tax purposes. His authority extended to verifying numbers and ensuring proper documentation, nothing more. He had no power to prosecute crimes that weren't crimes under state law. He had no authority to free enslaved people whose bondage was legally sanctioned. He could not rescue Matilda or her children or undo 3 decades of systematic exploitation. But he could create a record. He could document what he'd found in official reports filed with state authorities. He could ensure that someone somewhere would know that this happened. That evidence existed. That one auditor in 1849 had read the Beaumont ledgers and recognized the horror they contained. Jonathan Caldwell spent 3 days drafting his report in that temporary office while Clarendon County rebuilt around him. He wrote and rewrote, struggling to find language that would convey what he discovered without seeming hysterical or overstepping his authority as a state auditor. The final version included his standard property assessment: land, buildings, enslaved people, equipment, all valued according to South Carolina's formulas for taxation purposes. But attached was a separate document, 12 pages long, marked findings requiring state review. In this attachment, Caldwell detailed what the Beaumont ledgers revealed. He cited specific dates and journal entries. He traced the pattern from Theodore to Nathaniel to Alexander. He documented Matilda's 15 children across 33 years born to grandfather, father, and grandson. He quoted directly from the journals where Beaumont men described their deliberate education of each new generation in what they called proper mastery. He provided evidence for every claim, building a case not for prosecution, which was impossible under existing law, but for historical record. His conclusion was carefully worded. These documents reveal practices that, while legally permissible under current statutes, demonstrate systematic exploitation across generations that raises profound questions regarding the moral foundations of property rights as currently defined. The explicit documentation by the perpetrators themselves, preserved with evident pride rather than shame, suggests that legal frameworks permitting such conduct require examination by those with authority to consider whether laws that enable multi-generational sexual violence against enslaved women serve the interests of justice, or merely the convenience of those who benefit from such arrangements. Caldwell knew his language was bold, potentially dangerous for a state employee in South Carolina in 1849, but he also knew that someone needed to say clearly what the records proved: that slavery enabled systematic rape, that enslavers documented their crimes with confidence that law and society would protect them, that 3 generations of one family had used one woman's body and then her daughter's bodies as vehicles for work, teaching young men what absolute power looked like in practice. He submitted the report to the state auditor's office in Columbia on the 3rd of April, 1849. The response came 3 weeks later. State Auditor General James Henderson acknowledged receipt of Caldwell's property assessment, which was filed as routine documentation, but the attached findings were returned to Caldwell with a brief note: "Your observations regarding the Beaumont family's private affairs exceed the scope of tax assessment responsibilities. Such matters, if they raise concerns, should be addressed through appropriate channels by parties with standing to bring suit. As a state auditor, your role is to verify property valuations, not to offer commentary on the lawful exercise of property rights by South Carolina citizens." The message was clear. Caldwell's attempt to create an official record had been rejected. The state had no interest in examining what the Beaumont ledgers revealed. Henderson's reference to lawful exercise of property rights made explicit what everyone already understood. Slavery gave enslavers absolute authority, and any sexual violence that occurred within that framework was legally protected, officially unacknowledged, and deliberately beyond the reach of government intervention. Caldwell was ordered to return to Clarendon County to complete his routine tax assessment work. He was instructed to submit a revised report containing only standard property valuations without editorial commentary, and he was quietly warned that continued attempts to use his position to challenge slavery's legal foundations would result in termination and possible prosecution for exceeding his authority. He complied. Caldwell submitted the requested revised report in May 1849, documenting the Beaumont plantation's value in columns of numbers that revealed nothing about how that value had been generated or what suffering it represented. But before returning the Beaumont ledgers to the county records office, now rebuilt after the fire, he made copies of key passages. He spent his own money to have a clerk transcribe sections of Theodore's and Nathaniel's and Alexander's journals, along with the relevant birth entries from plantation ledgers. These copies he kept, storing them in his personal papers with a note explaining their significance. "I cannot stop what occurs on the Beaumont plantation," Caldwell wrote in that note dated the 15th of May, 1849. "I cannot free Matilda or her children. I cannot prosecute men who have committed no crime under South Carolina law. But I can preserve evidence that this happened, documented by the perpetrators themselves, so that if history ever develops eyes to see what we currently choose to ignore, these records will testify to truths that our generation lacks courage to acknowledge." Caldwell left South Carolina shortly after completing his work in Clarendon County. He relocated to Pennsylvania, finding employment with a shipping company in Philadelphia. Far from the plantation economy, whose legal protections for systematic abuse had cost him his career for simply documenting what he'd found, he carried those copied documents with him, preserving them among his personal papers, uncertain whether they would ever matter, but unwilling to let the evidence disappear entirely. Back on the Beaumont plantation, life continued its established patterns. Nathaniel managed rice cultivation with the efficiency his father had instilled. Alexander learned plantation operations, gradually assuming more responsibility as Nathaniel prepared him for eventual inheritance. Matilda, now in her 50s, performed what work she remained capable of, her body worn beyond recovery by decades of childbearing and labor. Her children and grandchildren moved through roles determined by the plantation's needs and the Beaumont family's assessments of their capabilities. The 1848s brought increasing sectional tensions that would culminate in war. Though in 1849, few anticipated how drastically everything would change within a decade. South Carolina's planter class remained confident in slavery's permanence, in constitutional protections and economic necessity that would preserve the institution indefinitely. The Beaumont family, like their neighbors, invested in expansion, purchased additional enslaved people at Savannah auctions, and planned futures built on assumptions that the system enabling their wealth and authority would endure unchanged. Matilda died in November 1852 at age 44. The cause listed in plantation records was simply illness. No details, no diagnosis, no acknowledgement that her body had been destroyed by 33 years of continuous exploitation. Nathaniel's journal entry noting her death was brief. "The Negro woman Matilda expired yesterday after extended decline. She served 3 generations of our family with reliable productivity. Her numerous offspring continue useful service, representing significant accumulated property value and demonstrating effective management principles. A replacement house servant will be purchased at the next Savannah auction." The tone was clinical, transactional, completely absent any recognition of Matilda as a human being who had suffered across decades of systematic violence. Nathaniel noted her death the way he might note the loss of productive equipment. Regrettable from a property standpoint, but requiring only practical adjustment. The phrase "served 3 generations of our family" carried meanings Nathaniel apparently saw no need to examine or acknowledge. Matilda was buried in the enslaved people cemetery on the Beaumont plantation, a clearing beyond the rice fields where wooden markers deteriorated in low country weather and humidity. No stone marked her grave. No service acknowledged the specific circumstances of her life. The enslaved community buried her with whatever ceremony they could manage within the limited time and resources available to them, marking her passing in ways the historical record doesn't preserve. Her children remained enslaved on the Beaumont property or on neighboring plantations where some had been sold. Ruth, the youngest, born in 1848 to Alexander Beaumont, was 4 years old when her mother died. She would grow up knowing Matilda only through stories told by older siblings, learning her own origins from people who had lived through what Ruth would only hear described. The family Matilda had borne through violence continued, carrying forward into generations that would eventually experience freedom, but would never fully escape the trauma embedded in their genealogy. The Civil War arrived in 1859, 7 years after Matilda's death. Nathaniel Beaumont was 51 years old, too old for combat service, but deeply committed to the Confederate cause. He contributed money and supplies to military units. The plantation provided rice to feed Confederate soldiers. Alexander, now 20, served briefly in a South Carolina regiment before being sent home to manage plantation operations that were essential to the war effort. The Beaumont family, like the broader planter class, fought desperately to preserve the system that had enabled their wealth and maintained their authority. The war came to Clarendon County in late 1859, when Union forces captured Port Royal Sound and established one of the war's most extensive occupied territories. White planters fled inland, abandoning their properties in panic. Nathaniel and Alexander Beaumont left in November 1859, taking portable valuables but leaving the plantation itself, the enslaved people, and most records behind. They never returned. Both died during the war years. Nathaniel from illness in 1861. Alexander from wounds received at Petersburg in 1862. The enslaved people on the Beaumont plantation experienced Union occupation as the beginning of freedom. Though the transition was complex and uncertain, federal authorities established the Port Royal Experiment, one of the war's first major efforts at transitioning from slavery to free labor. Formerly enslaved people began working land for wages, establishing schools, building churches, creating the institutional foundations of free black communities in the Low Country. Among those who experienced this transition were Matilda's surviving children and grandchildren. The records from this period are fragmentary, but some evidence exists of their post-emancipation lives. Sarah, the eldest, appears in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1864 as a teacher in one of the schools established for formerly enslaved people. She was 39 years old, teaching children to read using materials provided by Northern missionary societies. Whether she ever spoke about her own origins, about being born to Theodore Beaumont and then used by Nathaniel Beaumont, about the grandmother-father-grandson pattern that had defined her family's experience across generations, this the records don't preserve. Other children scattered after emancipation, leaving the Low Country entirely, or moving to Savannah and other cities where they might build lives disconnected from plantation origins. Many changed their names, a common practice among formerly enslaved people who wanted to establish identities separate from the families who had owned them. Whether any of Matilda's descendants retained the name Beaumont or chose different surnames that would sever linguistic connection to their exploiters remains unclear from available documentation. The Beaumont plantation property went through various hands after the war. The main house, abandoned in 1859, gradually deteriorated. Reconstruction-era economic instability and the collapse of rice cultivation in the Low Country made large plantations difficult to maintain. By the 1880s, much of the former Beaumont property had been subdivided and sold. Some portions to formerly enslaved people who purchased small plots, others to speculators hoping for eventual recovery of land values. The physical landscape that had contained Matilda's entire life slowly transformed. The buildings collapsing, the fields reverting to marsh and forest, the evidence of what had occurred there eroding into the Low Country soil. The ledgers and journals survived, preserved initially in the county records office where Jonathan Caldwell had returned them in 1849. They remained filed as routine plantation documents, examined occasionally by researchers studying Low Country agricultural history or genealogists tracing family lines, but their full significance largely unrecognized. The journal's explicit descriptions of systematic sexual exploitation were read by various people over the decades, usually producing discomfort that led to quick refiling rather than deeper examination. Caldwell's copied transcripts remained in his personal papers in Philadelphia. He lived until 1887, working in shipping and commerce, never returning to South Carolina. His papers were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania after his death, including the transcribed passages from the Beaumont ledgers, along with his explanatory notes. These sat in archival storage for decades, one collection among thousands. Their contents unknown except to the occasional researcher who examined Caldwell's papers for other purposes. The first serious historical examination of the Beaumont case occurred in 1930 when a graduate student at the University of South Carolina researching plantation record-keeping practices discovered the original ledgers in Clarendon County's historical collections. Margaret Thornhill was studying how enslavers documented the people they held in bondage, examining the bureaucratic systems that reduced human beings to inventory entries. The Beaumont ledgers stood out immediately for their unusual explicitness about sexual exploitation. Thornhill spent months working through the documents, cross-referencing the journals against birth records, tracing Matilda's children through multiple generations, documenting the pattern that connected Theodore to Nathaniel to Alexander. Her master's thesis, completed in 1931, provided the first scholarly analysis of what the records revealed. She wrote carefully, using academic language that sometimes obscured the violence she was describing, but her core argument was clear. The Beaumont family had practiced and documented systematic multi-generational sexual exploitation with a thoroughness that revealed how deeply such practices were embedded in slavery's structure. The thesis attracted attention from other historians studying slavery. But broader public awareness remained limited. Academic historical work in the 1930s reached relatively narrow audiences, and discussions of slavery's sexual dimensions remained controversial, even in scholarly contexts. Many white Southerners still defended slavery as benevolent or necessary, resisting any examination that challenged romantic narratives about the Old South. Thornhill's work was filed in university archives, cited occasionally by other researchers, but largely unknown beyond specialists. The civil rights movement of the 1948s and 1958s gradually created space for more honest examination of slavery's realities. As Black Americans fought for basic rights and white supremacist violence was broadcast nationally, the mythology of benevolent slavery became harder to maintain. Historical scholarship increasingly emphasized slavery's brutality, its sexual violence, its systematic dehumanization. The Beaumont case began appearing more frequently in academic works, examining enslaved women's experiences under slavery's absolute authority. By the 1968s and 1978s, historians studying slavery had developed frameworks for understanding cases like Matilda. They documented how sexual exploitation functioned as a tool of control, how enslaved women's bodies were treated as property available for masters' use, how laws that defined enslaved people as property rather than persons enabled systematic rape with complete legal protection. The Beaumont ledgers provided unusual documentation of patterns these historians knew were widespread, but rarely so explicitly recorded. Modern understanding recognizes that Matilda's experience, while extraordinarily well documented, was not exceptional in its basic dynamics. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women was endemic to slavery across the Americas. What made the Beaumont case distinctive was the multi-generational nature deliberately passed from grandfather to grandson, and this meticulous documentation that preserved evidence typically hidden in strategic silence. The records force confrontation with realities that most enslavers took care not to document so explicitly. The Beaumont plantation site today is barely recognizable as having once been the center of a major rice operation. The land is partly occupied by a nature preserve with walking trails through what was once cultivated fields. Some portions remain in private hands, undeveloped land where low-country forests have reclaimed territory that slavery's forced labor had transformed. No historical marker notes what occurred there. South Carolina's Historical Marker Program, which has installed hundreds of plaques across the state, has not erected one at the former Beaumont property. The Enslaved People's Cemetery, where Matilda was buried in 1852, has been lost entirely. No maintained markers remain. No clear boundaries define the space. Coastal erosion and vegetation growth have obscured whatever evidence once existed. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1988s identified some possible grave locations through ground-penetrating radar. But no excavation has occurred, and no specific graves can be definitively identified. Matilda's burial place exists somewhere in that landscape, unmarked and forgotten, except in the records that documented her exploitation while erasing her humanity. The descendants of Matilda's children, now scattered across multiple generations and likely numbering in the hundreds, almost certainly know nothing of their ancestors' story or their connection to the Beaumont family. The genealogical documentation that might trace those lines has been lost or was never created. Emancipations, chaos, the destruction of Freedmen's Bureau records, name changes, and the general lack of attention to black genealogy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries all contributed to severing connections between Matilda's descendants and knowledge of their origins. Some descendants of the Beaumont family still live in South Carolina, though the connection to the plantation Nera family is distant now through multiple generations. Whether any possessed knowledge of what Theodore, Nathaniel, and Alexander documented in those ledgers, whether family oral history preserved any acknowledgement of the pattern that defined the Beaumont plantation's operation for 3 decades, remains unknown. Most likely, the white descendants are as ignorant of this history as the black descendants, separated by time and deliberate forgetting from truths their ancestors either experienced or perpetrated. The Beaumont ledgers and journals remain preserved in various archival collections. The originals are housed at the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston, available to researchers but rarely examined. Caldwell's transcribed copies reside at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, filed among his papers. Digital scans have been created in recent years, making the documents more accessible to scholars, though public awareness remains limited. What does this story demand from us? The Beaumont case is not ancient history. Matilda died in 1852, just 170 years ago. People alive today have great-grandparents who were born closer to her death than to the present moment. The legal system that protected Theodore and Nathaniel and Alexander Beaumont's systematic exploitation was built on frameworks of white supremacy that didn't end with emancipation, but transformed into Jim Crow's segregation into ongoing racial inequalities that shape American society today. The documentation exists. The evidence is preserved. We know what happened on the Beaumont plantation because the perpetrators wrote it down with confidence that law and society would protect them. They were correct. No one stopped them. No one prosecuted them. No one even officially acknowledged what they were doing until Jonathan Caldwell tried in 1849 and was silenced by authorities who had no interest in examining slavery's realities. Does knowing this history create obligations? Should descendants of enslaved people and descendants of enslavers both confront these documented truths about how their families were connected through systematic violence? Should communities where such plantations existed acknowledge what occurred there? Mark the sites. Teach the history to students who need to understand what slavery actually entailed beyond sanitized textbook descriptions. These questions remain contested. Many Americans prefer comfortable distance from slavery's specifics, acknowledging it was wrong in abstract terms while avoiding the documented details that reveal how thoroughly it corrupted everyone it touched. The Beaumont ledgers force confrontation with specifics. They name names, provide dates, preserve the perpetrator's own words, justifying systematic rape as plantation management. They make denial impossible for anyone willing to actually read what Theodore and Nathaniel and Alexander Beaumont wrote. Matilda existed. She lived 44 years, bore 15 children to 3 generations of men who treated her as property, and died without ever experiencing freedom or justice. Her story was nearly erased, preserved only because an auditor in 1849 had the moral courage to document what he found, despite knowing it would cost him his career. We owe it to her memory and to all the enslaved women whose exploitation was never documented so explicitly to tell these stories. To refuse the comfortable forgetting that lets us pretend slavery was something less brutal than the records prove it was. If this story affected you, if you believe these truths matter, then share this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts about what obligations we have to confront documented history. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the realities textbooks often skip. These are difficult histories, but But difficulty doesn't excuse ignorance. The records exist. The evidence is preserved. We choose whether to look at it honestly or continue the willful blindness that protected slavery and its aftermath for so long. The story of Matilda and the Beaumont family isn't exceptional because it's unusually horrific. It's exceptional because someone documented it. How many other enslaved women experienced similar systematic exploitation across generations, but left no records because their enslavers practiced strategic silence? How many stories remain unknown because the evidence was deliberately destroyed or simply never preserved? These questions should haunt us because the answer is thousands, tens of thousands. The Beaumont plantation was one operation among thousands across the South. Matilda's experience was documented, but it wasn't unique. And until we confront that truth honestly, until we acknowledge what slavery actually was rather than what we'd prefer it had been, we can't fully understand the history that shaped our present or the obligations that history creates. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories need to be told, and they need audiences willing to hear them, no matter how uncomfortable the truth becomes. If this tale of hidden horrors in America's past gripped you, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. What part of this story hit you hardest, and why do you think we must remember these truths today? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the untold chapters of history. Your engagement keeps these vital stories alive. Let's keep the conversation going. See you in the next one.